Welcome to the TGIM Thank God It's Monday podcast, where we explore how Jesus is at work in and through his people in a whole variety of jobs and sectors. My name's Mark Green.
And I'm Anna Marie Green. This is my dad.
I am, it's true.
He's worked in advertising, taught in theological college, and he now works for LICC. I, on the other hand, have had quite a varied career. So I started in executive search, worked for a fintech, and I now work for a Christian charity. So a bit of experience in Christian and so-called secular environments.
Well, today our theme is boundaries and burnout with senior executive, mentor and author Chris Gillies.
So, Dad, have you ever burnt out?
Well, I have to say I got very close in those sort of intense early days in advertising, but I never kind of went over the edge. But I know you've had some struggles in this area.
Yeah, I've definitely been burnt out, and I've got close to being burnt out again a few times. Kind of got to a point where I lost all sense of passion, all sense of energy or motivation, and it can be a really difficult place to be. But I learned the importance of setting boundaries the hard way, I would say. But I'm actually really excited for this episode because I think it will help everyone, whether they've experienced burnout or not. Boundaries is so important.
Yeah, it's certainly an issue that never, ever goes away. So it's going to be great to have Chris Gillies with it. So let's get into it. Chris, it's fantastic to have you with us. I know you've been in some very, very demanding jobs. I know you've taught and mentored scores of young workers, and you've also written this excellent book, if I may say so, On the Way to Work, which I even commended. Very irritating. You should write a book which is in direct competition with mine, but well done on this.
Mark.
It's a super book. Give us a snapshot, if you would, of, if you like, your career so far, just a little smidgen, and then tell us what inspired you to put finger to keyboard to produce this.
Yes, so 40 years in financial services with companies like KPMG, Allied Dunbar, Eagle Star, Zurich Insurance. And I guess I've done a wide variety of different roles, but just to pick two or three to give you a sense, I've been chief executive of a private bank. I've been managing director of a life insurance company, and I've been chief growth officer for a global financial services group. So some pretty high-powered, high-pressured jobs. Alongside that, I volunteer for charity a lot. So I've been a trustee of quite a few charities and done quite a lot of mentoring of executives in the not-for-profit space. So I'd like to think I'm not just a business guy, and I understand the not-for-profit world as well as the for-profit world. On that journey, I guess I started out, I really wanted to do a good job. I really wanted to work well. And I looked for role models, and I looked for ideas and ways to do a great job. And the more I traveled that road, the more I realized that actually there weren't that many resources. Your books were actually the only resources I could find in the early days. And it was, I think, because I had to learn all this stuff the hard way, that I wanted to try and write down some of the things that I'd learned, some of the things that I found important, so that younger folks, folks like you, Anna Marie,
I know you're looking at her now, are you?
Yeah, absolutely. But really, there's stuff for people of all ages in my book, but I really wanted to try and write down the things that I'd learned so that people could not take the decades it took me to learn this stuff, maybe save you some time and give you a bit of a hand up, just because these are the things I found really helpful.
So boundaries and burnout is a pretty huge topic. And I think it's actually a really difficult topic for Christians personally as well, because in scripture, we see kind of two sides to this issue. So we have scriptures like in Colossians where it says, work at everything with all your heart as if for the Lord. But then on the other hand, we know that Jesus says, come to me all who are weary and I will give you rest. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. So it can be really confusing to navigate. So Chris, could you just give us an insight, like how do we start? Where do we begin when we're thinking about boundaries?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're quite right, because it's a crucial topic. At first sight, those two scriptures can be contradictory. I think you have to read the first scripture in the light of the second scripture. And I think you have to have a right view of work, and you have to have a right view of yourself. So, I mean, maybe just break that down a bit. Let's start with the right view of work. I think we begin often in our daily work with a whole set of concepts and culture and viewpoints that our employer gives us and that our peers give us. And I think it's really important to go right back to scripture and the theology of work, which is not something you hear taught on a Sunday very often, but it's critically important. And I think there are two scriptures, just to explain it in a nutshell. There's an amazing section in Colossians chapter 1, where St. Paul is explaining Jesus and the cross and the resurrection and how that redeems all things. And he repeats the words all things many times through that passage. And the last bit says, for God was pleased to have all his fullness dwell in him, that's Jesus, and through him to reconcile to himself all things, whether things on earth or things in heaven, by making peace through his blood shed on the cross. Now, that's a really profound scripture, but if you unpack it, all things, he's not leaving anything out. And it's not just material things, because he talks about things on earth and in heaven. So I think that includes our work. And I think that Jesus redeems, repairs, restores our work. And then when you go right back to Genesis, where we see the fall, we see how sin and selfishness really disrupt the pattern that God had originally allowed for work. I think that creates an opportunity for the cross to redeem the sweat, the thorns and the thistles that are referred to in Genesis chapter 3, that are actually the reason why we find work hard. So if we can somehow find a way to bring Jesus, his death and his resurrection into our thinking about work, then we start to see a solution to the possibility of burnout and hard work and toil and sweat. And I think one of the first ways we can do that is by understanding what Scripture says about things like Sabbath. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that does make sense. I think it reminds me of in Hebrews, where it says we have a high priest that is able to sympathize with our weaknesses, right? And so he knows the thorns and the thistles. That's acknowledged, right, in Genesis, that it's tough. So yeah, definitely.
Well, it's also connected, isn't it, in Genesis 1? I mean, work and rest is connected right there, isn't it? So 6 days, and then boom, here comes the Sabbath. Zigga,
Yes.
zagga, zigga, zagga, here comes the Sabbath.
And I love that, because on the 6th day, God creates human beings and he gives them a whole bunch of things to do. I mean, a whole bunch of work. But on the 7th day, they don't get down to it. They have a day off. And for me, that's so important, that we see God's pattern for creation as you start with a day of rest and then you get down to work. In our culture, the weekend is it sets us up to think that we work really hard and then we rest, whereas actually the godly approach is that we start with a day of rest, and out of that sense of rest and refreshment we then come to work. And I think that little twist is really, really important in helping us approach work in the right way. If we work till we're tired and then we rest, we have a different feeling about it than if we rest and we begin work from a position of refreshment. And that's why I think Christians, it's one of the reasons why Christians see Sunday as the first day of the week, not the last day of the week.
I was just thinking that, like, does the week start on Saturday then, or Friday night? Is that when that kind of mindset of that's how we ground ourselves for the rest of the week? What does that look like for you then? Because I think a lot of people might say, well, I work 5 days and I technically take 2 days off on the weekend. What does intentional Sabbath look like, do you think?
Well, it's a great question. And I do think that there's a lot to learn from Scripture, but we also have to translate it into a modern context. So I think when you look at the Scripture, it's clearly very important. It's one of the Ten Commandments. It's repeated throughout the Old Testament that Sabbath is important. And then Jesus comes along and, on the one hand, counterculturally, he's healing on the Sabbath. He's apparently working on the Sabbath. These are the things that the Pharisees, claim is work and therefore wrong. And Jesus is rebuking them and saying, no. The whole point about Sabbath is God provided Sabbath for us, humans, so that we could work from rest. And I think that's the first thing. The second thing is, when you look at the kind of Sabbath principles, it starts with a family meal in Jewish culture, and it includes some worship. And I do think it's really important that Sabbath is life-giving and provides a source of joy as well. And this is what I think Jesus was criticizing with the Pharisees, because he was basically saying Sabbath has evolved into something that is unhelpful. And even today, Orthodox Jews have, a long list of, I can't remember, about 40 different activities that they say are work and should not be done on the Sabbath, including, for example, the tearing of perforated toilet paper. So, we can get bogged down in these things. And for me, I think the most important thing is that you have 24 hours off. It doesn't have to start at a particular time. There was a time in my career when I was working really hard, and I found it helpful for my Sabbath to begin at noon on Saturday and actually finish after lunch on Sunday. And what that allowed me to do was, if work was really pressured, I could do a bit of work on Saturday morning. I could still have 24 hours off, spend time with my family, have Sunday lunch, and then I'd be off to Heathrow Airport to fly to some country where I had meetings on Monday morning. But 24 hours, really important, including family time, including some time for worship, and most importantly, life-giving, joyful stuff, if you can find the things that work for you.
I think the life-giving, joyful stuff is really important. When I was younger, so much younger than today, and I was, trying to work out the Sabbath business for myself, I stopped doing any work as I had defined work. But I defined work rather badly. So I decided that Sunday would be the day that I would do my washing, 3 loads of it. Sunday would be the day that I would do the drying of the washing and the ironing of the washing, and I would tidy this and tidy that. So this wasn't work, but my goodness, it was work. I mean, it's work any other day of the week, but it was actually work. And so that got me into trouble, and it was the really significant moment was when I suddenly realized, no, this notion that it's refreshment. But I think Sabbath is both stopping work, it's also refreshment, but it's also a reorientation towards God.
Yes.
There's a sense in which it's an act of trust, the stopping of the work. It's, in a sense, we can see it as just technical, and there's lots of research, as you know better than I, saying, well, if you rest, good for you. But lots of people could rest. But I think there's something about trusting in God, and trusting that as I stop, he's going to provide. I can not harvest. I mean, that's one of the things it says in Scripture, isn't it? Even in harvest, you take your Sabbath. And of course, harvest is time-bound.
Yes.
You can't, if the rain comes, you lose it. If the hail comes, you lose it. So I think there's something about this as an act of trust, an act of stopping, which reflects our trusting in God for everything in life, but particularly for our provision, for the things that we think work gives us: money, security, power, position.
Yeah, I really like that idea of an act of trust. And it's so easy just to work at different things.
Yeah, well, guilty. Yeah.
So, and everybody has to figure this out for themselves, because the things that give me life are not necessarily the things that would give you life or the things that you would find joyful. We're all different. And so I do think we can't get too prescriptive about this. But I've come across people who work 50, 60-hour weeks. They fit in the washing and the ironing, on a Saturday. And on a Sunday, they're serving in 3 different ministries at church and, attending a couple of services. And these are all good things. There's nothing intrinsically wrong with any of those things. But we have to create these boundaries and make sure that this principle of Sabbath, that I think it does involve that trust and that space to allow for rest, real rest, and to allow us to put God at the centre. And when I say God at the centre, I do mean God rather than church or church programmes or, anything else that I might choose to fill my Sunday with. I think that's really, really important.
I'm really interested about that idea of working from rest, because we have the Sabbath, almost like a day or a period where we have that. But as you were mentioning, I think working from rest is also day to day, from being in a restful place. And I think of myself and the struggles I've had with Sabbath is I would sometimes think, well, that's a great day to go to the gym and really push myself. And I do like going to the gym, but it's also not really rest as well for me. It's still a challenge. It's still part of kind of my self-improvement. And so I would still have this sense that I want to spend it well. And there was a kind of psychology that I feel like the Lord has been showing to me, which is optimizing everything.
Yes.
And that kind of he's also shown me that in my day-to-day work life, how I've put kind of pressures on myself that aren't from him and aren't even from my employer. And that's enabled me to not work from a restful place, because there's this kind of inner dialogue that kind of is always more, could always do better, could be more efficient. So can you speak a little bit on what that means Monday to Friday for people?
Yes, but if I may, I'd just like to start one step back, because I think what you've touched on is really encapsulated well by St. Paul when he says, we're not under law, we're under grace. And I think it's God's grace and a recognition that, yes, on the one hand, there's nothing we can do to live up to, the high standards of holiness that God displays. But on the other hand, there's so much grace that when we fail, when we struggle, it shouldn't create pressure for us. It has there is a really important grace dynamic that means we hold in tension the desire to improve ourselves, to do well, to do a great job. But we hold that in tension with the fact that God's grace is all that we need, and that can provide us with a huge sense of peace. So I start with that. And then I think, yes, so we've talked about a weekly rhythm of working from rest through a Sabbath practice. But then there's a whole bunch of very straightforward but really important things that we can do Monday to Friday. It's important to get the right amount of sleep. And, I said at the beginning, we need to have the right view of work. We need to have the right view of ourselves. Well, knowing yourself involves knowing whether you're one of those people who can get away with 4 hours sleep a night, like Margaret Thatcher, I think, reputedly, or Winston Churchill. But actually, if you just emulate them, when your body needs 7 or 8 hours sleep, it's a recipe for disaster. So learning the rhythms of your body and understanding how much sleep you need, understanding what it takes to relax, just something simple as taking a deep breath, an inhale, and then an exhale that's twice as long as your inhale. Do that 3 or 4 times. I find that can be an incredible stress reliever in between meetings, for example. So I think there are little things like that it's important for us to be aware of. Diet, exercise, fresh air, sleep. These are all very, very important in order to work from a place of rest every single day. And then I think longer term, one of the things I used to do was I used to plan my holidays and my time off so that I was never more than 3 months away from at least a week's holiday. So that, that revolved around things like family birthdays, Christmas, Easter, our wedding anniversary. And I just tried to make sure that we had a decent break scheduled in every 3 months. And then later in my career, and I must confess, I didn't learn this till I was 55, but it was a really helpful thing, an annual retreat where you just go away somewhere for a day or two, and you spend a day or two reflecting on the last year, thinking about the year that's coming. And the first time I did it, I was invited to reflect on the last 10 years and the next 10 years. And
Did you need a week for that?
That was a bit of a challenge. Yeah, it was a bit of a challenge. But I just think that rhythm, it's more than a weekly rhythm. It actually runs daily, weekly, quarterly, annually.
Yeah.
Certainly that worked for me anyway.
Certainly the historic sort of rules of life that you see with the monks, and also the contemporary new monastics and common rules and things are very much like that. One of the things, though, I think about what Anna-Marie was saying was in terms of knowing yourself. It's not only knowing your body, is it? A number of things that she was confessing to, as it were actually to do with attitudes or view of herself, which was getting in the way. And that's a slightly different dynamic, isn't it? It's almost as, God... Yeah, I mean, he forgives us, there's grace, but also other things are going on which drive us in certain directions. Yes,
and I think the mental pressure is probably the biggest contributor to burnout. Often, though, the mental pressures build up because we haven't paid enough attention to the physical pressures. So we have to think about both of them. But knowing your capacity, it's really tricky, because how do you, when you're starting out at work, first time ever, and you walk into the office and you realise that everybody else has arrived before you, and so over a few weeks you discover that actually most people are clocking in at least an hour before work's meant to start, and some of them 2 hours before work's meant to start. So suddenly you take that on because you want to impress and you want to do the right thing. And then you notice that until the boss goes, nobody else leaves. That's certainly the case when I worked in Asia. None of the Asians left their desks until the boss left. So you start to take on these habits because the people around you do them. And then you only learn that where your limits are when something difficult happens and you begin to burn out and you find yourself teetering on the precipice. So it's very difficult to know your limits until you've tested your limits. And that's why I think it's really important to be self-aware and to recognize when stress is beginning to get on top of you, and then take action to just try and relieve that stress by taking a break, going for a walk, taking a day off, whatever it might be. But we can't know our limits on day one. And that's why sometimes, as indeed I think you experienced, Anna-Marie, people do have a burnout episode. And it's so important not to let that take you down the plug hole. It's so important just to do what you need to do to reset, and then to learn from it, because you now know what that feels like. And so when you feel it coming again, hopefully you can set the boundaries and the limits earlier so that you can take corrective action sooner than you did the last time.
Yeah, and it makes me think of, like, sometimes as well that we feel powerless. So we feel like we're in a job where we can't set the boundaries that we want to set. We can't take the rest that we feel that our body needs. And I'd love to ask you on that, but I just wanted to share as well from experience how sometimes as well there'll be people that maybe are listening that feel like it's too much. I'm feeling really burnt out at work. I'm not able to focus. And something that I had to learn was that there were certain freedoms I actually did have in my contract that I wasn't using. So like a lot of people have kind of flexible hours, so I have to be there 10 till 4. And I just couldn't fathom stopping for an hour at 4 and then coming back. But that was my own kind of mindset of people weren't really doing that much, but I never kind of asked my boss, like, is it okay if I do that? I never, inquired about leaving the office early to avoid rush hour when I was dealing with chronic fatigue. And so what the Lord had to kind of teach me was there are actually freedoms I've given you that you're not using.
Yes.
Could you speak a bit about kind of practically if someone's feeling like work, the dynamic of work is feeling kind of pressure for them, how they can navigate setting those boundaries?
Yes, I think it's the first thing to recognise is that fear is a real paralyzer, and we can tell ourselves that something's not possible, or that I'm afraid that if I ask for this, I'll get knocked back, or I'll be, I'll be criticised for it. Well, I think those fears are far less serious than the burnout. So it's better to overcome the fears than to burn out and then try to overcome the burnout. That's the first thing I'd say. The second thing is, yes, I think it is worth really trying to be creative and think differently. Think about the outputs from your job. So you might have a job that requires a particular document to be prepared by a certain deadline. Let's just take that as a simple example. Well, as long as the document's prepared and the deadline is met, it doesn't really matter whether you had an hour off or not. That's more about appearances and what everybody else is doing. And so I think it's really important to understand the contract, as you say, which bits of behaviour at work are being caused by the culture of that particular work group. And is there really a problem if you work slightly differently from them, provided you deliver the results? I would say not. That shouldn't be a problem at all. So I'd encourage people to think creatively about how you work best, in what conditions you work best, and to use all the flexibility of the workplace, of technology, of the tools at your disposal, to work productively and effectively rather than long and hard.
It's also a manager question, isn't it? I mean, managers, good managers do that. I remember when I was, in New York, and the president of the company, a man called Ken Roman, took my then boss out, a guy called David Warden, who was senior vice president, management supervisor, who'd come from another place. And David Warden was a very relaxed English person in quite high intensity organisation. It wasn't brutal at all. Ogilvy was delightful, but most people worked hard and they worked fairly long. And David Warden would sort of come in on the normal time. He'd be gone at 5 o'clock every day. Very efficient. And on Fridays in the summertime, he'd be out the door at lunchtime. And so the president takes him out for dinner. And and I don't know what David Warden thought was coming, but Ken Roman says to David Warden, David, I know how you work, and I don't want you to change. Don't copy us.
Yeah.
You're really good at this. And he was. He did an enormous amount of good work by wandering around into people's offices and asking them what's going on. And after he'd asked you what's going on, you burbled and you realised he'd help you solve the problem by asking questions.
Yeah.
And then he'd just saunter off. So it looked like he was just chatting all day, but he wasn't.
Yes.
He was very efficient. And I think that question of also the managers shifting their view.
Yes.
You see it in some ways, something, it's not strictly analogous, but you've got things like, say a menopause policy, which is actually sort of saying there's a period, during a woman's life when she may not be as efficient as she was at other times and so on. And I think people recognizing, people going through things, the manager looking at this, where are you right now? I remember my boss, one of my bosses, I was actually, when I was at London School of Theology, and he really worked hard. He was Peter Cottrell. He was a hard worker, and I think worked harder than anybody there. And we had a big event coming up, a jubilee, and I was organising this jubilee, so I was working really hard. And he wrote me a letter, as in a physical thing, not just come into my office. He sent me this letter thanking me for all the work I was doing. And I said, Peter, you work twice as hard as me. You're always here, etc., etc., etc. He said, yes, but I'm not at the same life stage as you. I don't have a young family. And so what he was doing was looking at it in terms of the round. Not just your work, but all the other things that are actually in your life that you can't do. I had 3 young, precocious, exuberant, ebullient children to control or try to, So I think we're talking in a sense from below,
yes.
but I think also from above. There's a kind of, what are your outputs?
Definitely really important. And I think what you're describing is a kind of servant leadership where you're putting the people that you lead at the heart of your approach, rather than your own achievements and desires to get things done and to look good. And that's so important. And I think the other thing is sometimes managers and leaders are giving you work to test you out. I remember there was a time I'd just got a new role and I was working for the chief executive. It was a kind of chief of staff role. And he and I had never worked together before. I knew of his reputation. He knew of mine. There was a lot of respect between us. And I'd probably been in the job 3 or 4 months. And because it was a chief of staff role, he kept giving me more things to do. And every week, I'd ship another committee to go and attend, or another working group to lead, or another task to complete. And I was starting to get this real sense of, I'm not sure I can take any more. I think I'm at my limit. And I was really quite nervous of the next time he came in and offered, to give me another job. What would I do? But I had to, and this is the important thing. I had to find the courage to say to him, I'm really sorry, Lawrence, but if you give me that, I'm not sure I'm going to be able to deliver on it alongside all the other things that you've already given me. And I was expecting a negative reaction. And actually what I got was he smiled and he said, I've been wondering when you'd get to that point. I've been giving you more things just to see where your limits are, to understand your capacity. And it was a pretty cruel test, but he was actually testing out how much could I do. And if I'd kept my mouth shut and taken on that task and then the next one, I'd have just slowly sunk. And I wouldn't have been true to myself. I wouldn't have been true to him. And I don't think there's any shame in actually laying out for your boss, these are the things I've got on my plate. It's taking me all of my capacity to deliver these things. Can we have a talk about either me not taking on any more, or, and I find this a more helpful framing for people, can we talk about priorities? Which of these are the most important to you for me to deliver on? Because sometimes we have to prioritize for ourselves, but there's absolutely no harm in having a priority conversation with your boss and saying, look, I've got these 15 things you've given me. Realistically, I can probably only get half a dozen of them done in the next few weeks. Which are the most important? And I'm plucking the numbers out of the air, but it's the idea that we don't have to carry these burdens on our own. But also sometimes our bosses are testing us out. Here's a young talent. Wonder what their potential is. We'll give you some more. Just see how you cope. And if you just suck it up, eventually you burn out. And so I do think we've really got to be clear about our boundaries and have healthy conversations with our boss about what we can do and what we can't do. And if you don't want to say the words, I don't think I can do this, say the words, can you give me some guidance on priorities, which are the
Yeah.
most important tasks for me to deliver first.
We were smiling at that point, both of us, at each other, because, we've been in that situation.
Yeah.
I feel as well like some bosses aren't even, I mean, he's probably cheekily testing you, but I think some bosses they've got a boss. And so
Yeah.
they just want to see how much you can do because they've got deliverables, they've got things that
Absolutely.
need to be done. And actually, when I was just quite recently actually having that feeling of, oh, is he expecting me to be able to do all of this? And then actually I realized he then gave me feedback that I was very efficient. Oh, you're really efficient. And I thought I was behind.
Yes.
You know?
Yeah.
So yeah, that open communication. And I think it takes humility, kind of what you were talking about, wanting to do things well and framing it in that way for your boss. Like I'd had to do that recently of a project that I thought, I keep rushing this and I actually want to be really faithful with this project. I think it has a lot of potential and I feel that I don't have the time to give it what it deserves. And that ended up being a much more fruitful conversation because it was kind of a collaborative view. Like it's us as a team, as an organization. I want to do this justice, but having the humility to say, I can't right now. Can we think of a way that I can?
Yes.
So I really love you kind of mentioning that, kind of having that dynamic with your boss, and there's a relationship there to steward as well.
Yeah, it's important. And I think we've got to recognize if you're a Christian and you're working in a secular workplace, your boss may not be a Christian, their boss may not be a Christian, and there might be a sort of chain of command that is pressurizing. And that views work differently to the way that Christians view work. And so we have to learn to navigate that and to winsomely, do the things that are required of us whilst gently challenging the norms and the cultures.
But I think just to say that I think a Christian... I'm talking over you. How very rude of me.
That's okay. Go ahead, Mark.
But I just wanted to say, because I feel this quite strongly, as it were, that actually it's quite easy to overwork people in Christian organisations as well. And it may not be because people don't care about you, but because in fact there's a sense, not necessarily rightly, but there's a sense of this is a vocation, this is for the Lord, therefore. There's a dynamic behind that.
That's right.
So there's dangers there, and having connected to lots and lots of people who'd worked in Christian organisations, sometimes when we're less good at it actually than you see in secular places where there's very clear boundaries. You've got to sign a contract to work more hours.
And I think that's generally true in the not-for-profit space too. Charities sometimes, because people are very cause focused, and the cause is everything. And so my comfort is subordinated to the importance of the cause. So I think you're right. And I guess my point is we need to navigate the culture of the workplace, whether it's Christian, secular, charity, even public service, government or local government. That culture will have certain norms, and some of those norms might need to be challenged or pushed back on, and sometimes we have to find our way through that.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
So I guess it would be interesting to think of what if someone feels like they're too far gone. So they've kind of done all of this wrong. They're in a place where they're feeling burnt out. Love to hear what your insight might be for someone that's listening that might be in that place of feeling already kind of burnt.
Yeah, well, I think it's very hard to give such general advice, but I would say that your health and your mental well-being are more important than your reputation in your current job. And so because of that, depending on the situation, it might be time for a break. And it might be time, to give up that particular job. If you can afford it, maybe take some time off. I've often advised people in this kind of situation not to worry about the immediate, but will I get another job? Or, but won't this look bad on my CV? But to think about the long game, because in 10 or 15 years' time, that really won't count for very much if you had 3 months off. Sometimes you can quite honestly position it in your CV as time off to travel, or because you might want to go somewhere warm to recuperate. You might want to position it as time off to do a course or to do some personal development, or time off to think through a change in direction for your career. And I don't think there's any problem with framing it that way, even though the reason is that you need a break. And if you don't get a break, you're going to be really unwell, and that will make it much, much harder for you to, pursue your dreams and your career. So I do think it's very important, if you're in that place, to either get time off from your job. Maybe the doctor can sign you off for a few weeks, and you don't have to give up your work. But there are occasions where it's the workplace itself and the people in the workplace that are causing the problem, and you just need to get away and have a break. And I don't think people should feel a failure at that. It's a really important learning moment, and if you take the time, recover, learn, then you can come back twice as good.
Yeah, I want to share a very quick testimony, because the Lord was kind of ministering to me about that, feeling like I was going to get back to burnout a couple months ago. And there was a scripture he shared, actually from Colossians. I realized this book is quite good for this
it's my favorite
topic, because actually I had some money from a friend who really was encouraging me to go to a spa. And I thought, that's so indulgent as a Christian to go to a spa, but I don't have the energy to go to an airport or go on holiday. But there was some psychological barrier, but a spa is too far. Sure, you can go to France, but a spa, who does that? And even though the friend gave me money, I felt like it was a waste of money. It couldn't possibly be God's will. And I realized there was a lot of pride there. When I went to the spa, it was actually, he really ministered to me about rest. And there's this verse that he brought me from Colossians. And it says this, it's from Colossians 2. Since you died with Christ to the elemental spiritual forces of this world, why, as though you still belong to the world, do you submit to its rules? Do not handle, do not taste, do not touch. These rules, which have to do with things that are all destined to perish with use, are based on merely human commands and teachings. Such regulations indeed have an appearance of wisdom, with their self-imposed worship, their false humility, and their harsh treatment of the body, but they lack any value in restraining sensual indulgence. And the verse harsh treatment of the body, I think in the New King James Version, is neglect of the body. That has there's nothing righteous that comes from neglecting your body, actually. And it was so profound to me. Really white knuckling your way through isn't making you any holier. I'm not impressed by it.
Yes. Yeah.
And you refusing to go to a spa, it doesn't make you more righteous of a Christian.
Yeah.
It's ridiculous looking back, but I think there's something psychologically of allowing yourself to, your care of your body might need to be more than the average person if you're going through burnout. So I just wanted to share that because I'd never seen self-care in scripture in that same way.
Yeah. No, I think it's a really, really beautiful story and passage. So thank you. Yeah. I think when it comes to faith and work, Colossians is my favorite book. It's packed full of advice that you can really translate into a modern workplace context. And I think you've just hit the nail on the head with that one. Yeah.
Well, it indeed is. Colossians is indeed just one of the great books. And as you began by unpacking Colossians 1 for us, and the famous verse at the end, whatever you do, only really makes sense because of Colossians 1:15 to 20. Because everything matters to Jesus, because he's going to redeem everything. Anything we do sits within his glorious purposes for us and indeed for all creation. Chris, we're really grateful to you. It's great to not only read your book, which I have done and commended it, Chris's book on the way to work, in case you haven't noticed that. I do commend that to you. Thank you very much indeed.
Oh, thanks for having me.
For coming in.
Thank you, Chris. Your grace is just really shining through. And I actually think I've learned quite a lot from our conversation. So thank you. I have a copy of Thank God It's Monday for You, which you I think you may have read, but this may be not the updated edition. So we give that to all our guests.
Thank you very much. That's very kind of you. I do have a copy on my bookshelf, actually. I might ask you to sign it, Mark.
It reduces the value. But we also like you to have some Lindor chocolates, little red balls of delight,
Perfect.
which remind you, I hope, of the LICC logo, that indeed
Very
the red
on
dots,
brand, yes.
the Christian, is out there in the world to be a source of sweetness and encouragement to others, which we hope for all those who are listening. Whatever state you're in, may the Lord be with you. May he grant you his shalom, the shalom of body, peace of body, mind, heart and spirit this day and in all you do. Thanks very much for listening. Do go to the LICC website for oodles of good stuff on this topic and indeed others.